He looked at you with eyes that were absolutely piercing, not hostile, just real sincerity that said this man is unusual.
He was small, even by Vietnamese standards. Only 4 feet 11 inches tall and barely 100 pounds, he appeared frail.
He tried to project this image of himself as a simple, modest, emaciated, kind of wandering scholar. In fact, he was a tough guy.
Perhaps no leader in history has resisted the guns of the enemy as stubbornly or as long as this little man.
He's a very shrewd politician and a very good actor.
He had an unshakable will that helped liberate a country and humble a superpower. In the late 19th century, Indochina was France's most valuable colony. The French made huge amounts of money with rubber and rice exports, especially from the territory now known as Vietnam. Unfortunately, the native people received little or no benefit of this wealth. They had few rights within their own country and little hope for a better life. Life was only slightly better for the family of Ho Chi Minh.
What we do know about his family generally is that they were upper class or gentry, as were all the communist revolutionaries.
Ho Chi Minh's father, Huynh Sinh Soc, came from the village of Kim Lien in Nghệ An, a poor province in central Vietnam. On May 19, 1890, his wife gave birth to their 3rd child and their 2nd son. He was named Nguyen Sinh Kung, but would one day be known around the world as Ho Chi Minh. When Ho turned 11, tragedy struck the family. While his father was away, his mother died shortly after giving birth to a 3rd son.
You can imagine the effect this had. I mean, being faced with the fact that his father is away and his mother had died, and he was responsible for this, basically an infant. And when his father came back to Hue, he took him back to his home village.
Ho Chi Minh's father served as a mandarin or local official and spent a great deal of time away from home. Fortunately, relatives and family friends helped take care of Ho and his brother and sister. Initially, Ho's early education was in the traditional study of Chinese characters and Confucian philosophy.
But in his early teens, his father apparently became convinced that for his sons to succeed, they needed a French education. He sent both of them to a preparatory school run by the imperial regime in such a way as to instruct the students in the French language and French culture.
Though Ho's father worked for the imperial bureaucracy, he routinely criticized it for so easily relinquishing the country's independence to the French.
He was recalled to Hue, and eventually he was dismissed entirely from the bureaucracy. And it's at that point that his life fell apart. And he went to Saigon. He took a job for a while on a rubber plantation. Later he sold traditional medicines.
Ho's father spent the rest of his life wandering the countryside, struggling to make a living, while Ho lived in Hue. He saw less and less of his father. This had a great impact on Ho. He also believed that his father had been punished for simply saying what everyone knew was true. Most Vietnamese suffered greatly at the hands of their colonial masters. Those who protested or even complained were often imprisoned, beaten, or even killed by the omnipotent French colonials. In 1908, at the age of 17, Ho was studying at the prestigious National Academy in Hue. One day, a group of farmers marched past the school, protesting the high level of Mandarin corruption and excessive taxation. Ho translated their demands into French so the local colonial officials could read them. It was his first revolutionary act, and he attracted the attention of the dreaded Sûreté, or French secret police. The next day, Ho was summarily expelled from the academy. It was his last day of formal schooling in Vietnam.
So here's this young Ho Chi Minh who is becoming educated and has a certain amount of resentment toward French colonialism. But at the same time, he knows enough about France to be captivated by the great French ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity, and he wants to see how those ideals are really practiced in France. They're not practiced in Vietnam, where you have a rather repressive French colonial system.
Ho had inherited his father's rebelliousness and his wanderlust. At the age of 21, he entered a merchant marine school where he learned how to be a kitchen helper. This new skill enabled him to leave Vietnam and go abroad.
I think he left for two reasons. One is maybe quest for education, that he would be able to get better education in France, provided he could afford it. Second, he probably did not see much of an economic opportunity in Vietnam at that point of time.
Ho was hired by the French passenger liner, the La Touche-Treville. And in 1911, began an odyssey that would take him to nearly every corner of the world. Over the next few years, he saw the terrible impact of colonialism on many other countries. This had a profound influence upon him. Finally, Ho arrived in France. Despite his anti-colonial sentiments, Ho applied for entrance to the French colonial school that trained officials to serve in France's colonies around the world. This was hardly the career path of an anti-French revolutionary. Ho's application was turned down.
There's no indication as to how he reacted to the rejection, except that we may assume that it probably strengthened his assumption that he couldn't expect to work from within the system, that he was going to have to work outside the system. In other words, it could very well have been one of a whole series of steps that eventually led him into becoming a revolutionary.
Ho wandered around France for a year or so. He supported himself with a variety of odd jobs, including gardening and dishwashing. He went back out to sea between 1911 and 1917, traveling to Africa, South America, and even the United States. On one trip, he reportedly jumped ship in Boston and made his way down to New York City.
I mean, here he is seeing, as it would be to any kid from this faraway place, the skyscrapers, the highways, taking the subway up to the Bronx, taking the ferry to Hoboken. He was absolutely dazzled by the Statue of Liberty and everything it represented.
While working as a dishwasher in New York's Chinatown, Ho was amazed to learn that immigrants in the U.S. were entitled to legal rights that the Vietnamese weren't allowed to have under the French in their own country.
He said, I was with the lowest labor types in New York. There were blacks, there were Chinese, and they weren't quite as well treated as the Anglo-Saxons. But he said, you know, they could all vote. And this impressed him tremendously.
Shortly before the start of World War I, Ho left America and sailed to England. He found work in the kitchen of the famous Carlton Hotel under the legendary French chef Escoffier.
Escoffier is very impressed by Ho because Ho speaks French, because he's very courteous, and eventually is promoted to being the assistant pastry chef.
While in London, Ho had met many other passionate anti-colonialists from places like India, Africa, and Ireland. These contacts rekindled Ho's own nationalist notions. He rededicated himself to liberating his homeland. In 1917, he decided to forego a promising career as a pastry chef and moved to Paris. He would learn how to become a revolutionary. Ho Chi Minh arrived in Paris toward the end of World War I. There was a large Vietnamese community living there, but more important, This was where the decisions that affected colonial Vietnam were made. Ho was determined to help change French policy toward his country. But first, he wanted to experience Paris.
He wandered around the town and would go to art galleries, take in lectures, improving his French. He used to love to go to music halls, and one of his favorite singers was Maurice Chevalier. And he memorized these songs and went on for the rest of his life, without the straw hat, of course, singing Maurice Chevalier songs.
In Paris, Ho supported himself through a variety of odd jobs. He worked as a cook and he retouched photos. He even reported on boxing matches and reviewed films for a French newspaper. Of course, his primary goal was to somehow organize Vietnamese expatriates into a movement that would pressure the French government into improving conditions in his homeland.
People who encountered Ho Chi Minh in those days tended to say pretty much the same things. Very intense young man, very anxious to learn, very idealistic, a man very much driven by ideas. But what was remembered about him perhaps more than anything else was his sharp eyes that essentially seemed to penetrate the soul of the person who was talking to him.
Ho discovered that there were many Frenchmen who were sympathetic to his cause. These liberals encouraged him to join their socialist group and to write and publish his own ideas. Soon, Ho and other Vietnamese expatriates began publishing an anti-colonial newspaper directed toward the Vietnamese community in France. Their leaflets were even smuggled back to Vietnam.
All of his writings really are on that theme, what a rotten deal colonials are getting all over the French Empire, which indeed they were. And Ho's point of thinking is, how do you fix this? Do you fix it with revolution? Do you fix it with violence? How do you do it?
Writing under the pseudonym Nguyen Ai Quoc, or Nguyen the Patriot, Ho simply advocated better treatment and equal rights for his people, not revolution. He achieved a near-legendary status in certain circles back in Vietnam, where his rhetoric was considered visionary. Ho also attracted the attention of the imperial regime back home. They accused him of inciting treason and condemned him to death if he ever returned to Vietnam. In 1919, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson traveled to the Versailles Peace Conference to present his famous 14-point plan for world peace. Ho and his associates discovered that one of Wilson's key points was that all nations deserve the right to self-determination. Ho believed that this meant that the U.S. was advocating the end of the colonial system.
And Ho Chi Minh, thinking that this might apply to Vietnam, got himself all dressed up in a cutaway coat and striped pants and a top hat. And he went out to Versailles carrying with him a document that he had written, which was a kind of inventory of various cases of French repression in Vietnam. And his idea was to give this to Wilson so that the United States would then exert pressure on France. Well, he got very rudely rebuffed when he tried to go in to see Wilson or even deliver this.
Ho had believed that President Wilson would be sympathetic to Vietnam's plight. He was greatly disappointed that he was unable to present his case. This forced him to look elsewhere for help. A socialist showed Ho a paper that had been written by Vladimir Lenin. In it, the Soviet leader wrote that one of the keys to the spread of communism was the liberation of all colonies.
The Russians wanted to end colonialism not because they loved the people who were under colonial rule, but for their own selfish interests. They wanted to weaken the Western powers. But regardless of what their motivation was, they were the only power at the time to advocate it and to actively want to offer help.
And it's at that point, as he basically points out, that he determined to become a follower of Lenin, not because he had any understanding of Marxist ideology, but because he loved the strategy that Lenin had set forth as a means of liberating the colonial peoples.
In 1920, Ho became one of the founding members of the French Communist Party. He was 30 years old. He had become a great propagandist while living in Paris, but he wanted to learn how to turn rhetoric into revolutionary action. He believed there was really only one place to learn this craft: Moscow. In 1923, Ho received an invitation to join the Comintern, the organization set up by the Soviets to export Marxism and Leninism around the world. He jumped at the opportunity. He disappeared from Paris, leaving his friends wondering what had happened to him.
I think what drew Ho to Moscow, first and foremost, was nationalism, the desire to find help to liberate his country and his people.
Ho became an important member of the Comintern. He now took his orders from Moscow.
I always felt that Ho Chi Minh had very little time for Marxism as a philosophy, as a way of interpreting history. He had great admiration for Leninism and the techniques and the methods to be used.
The rest of the world may have abhorred Lenin's tactics, but Ho was devoted to them. He believed that he had found the blueprint for liberating his homeland. Ho received his first international assignment when he was sent to Canton in South China to help organized communist cadres. It was here that he also began a clandestine lifestyle that would last nearly 30 years.
He went underground, so to speak. And you have him wandering around the world under a wide variety of aliases. Some of them Vietnamese, some of them Chinese, depending on where he was and what purpose he needed. If, for example, he contributed to a French newspaper, he'd call himself Victor Le Bon. If he contributed to a Russian newspaper, he'd call himself Nafransky, and so forth.
In 1927, Ho was nearly arrested when the Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek turned against the communists. Ho narrowly escaped capture and a likely death sentence, and eventually made his way to Siam, or present-day Thailand. He avoided detection by agents of the Sûreté, or French secret police, via a clever ruse. He learned some Thai, shaved his head, donned a saffron robe, and traveled as a Buddhist monk. There was a large Vietnamese community living in northeast Thailand, so Ho preached his cause as he wandered from village to village in disguise.
I don't know of any other leader of his stature having done this kind of masquerading under different guises or having had to change his name so many times, which makes me wonder whether this was just a necessity or was it the sense of the drama in the man that prompted him to do this.
For most of the 1930s, Ho's whereabouts were not known. He had even been reported dead.
Ho just disappeared. He was either in the cave of Yan'an with Mao, he was in a Stalin jail. There's no world figure that you can say that we don't know where he was for almost a decade. And again, this was not accidental. I mean, he didn't want to be found.
Ho emerged again on the world stage shortly before the outbreak of World War II. He'd always believed that there would one day be a time when the conditions would be just right to begin the liberation of his homeland. When France fell to Germany in the early months of World War II, and the pro-German Vichy government took over the colonial rule of Vietnam, Ho believed that the moment had arrived. In early 1941, he slipped across the Chinese border and into the jungles of North Vietnam. Incredibly, this was the first time Ho had set foot in his homeland in over 30 years. He was armed only with his ideas, but he was determined to lead a revolution, to liberate his country, or to die trying. When Ho Chi Minh walked across the border into North Vietnam in 1941, it marked the first time he had set foot in his country since 1911. He had no weapons, almost no money, and very little support. But he was determined to organize a guerrilla movement that would drive the foreigners from his country.
He calls the movement the Viet Minh, which is an acronym for Independence League. And he takes for the first time this name Ho Chi Minh, which means roughly bringer of light. So Ho Chi Minh begins to exist under that name, the famous name, now 1941.
Well, there seems to be something of a myth that Ho Chi Minh, when he came back to Vietnam after 30 years of absence, was looked upon by, quote, everybody as the leader of Vietnam. I doubt that that's the case, because there was not the kind of media ability to influence the thought of people in the countryside. At that time, 90, maybe 95% of the people in Vietnam lived in small villages and cultivated rice.
There were educated Vietnamese in big cities like Hanoi and Saigon who greatly admired Ho's writings under his pen name Nguyen the Patriot. But they were in the minority. The vast majority of the people in the country were not familiar with Ho or his work. In fact, most of them could not read.
So his main aim was how to communicate and become close to the peasants. So he managed to adopt this very popular style, talking very simply to the peasants and being like an uncle, a member of the family.
Ho brought the role that his father had played as the avuncular village mandarin or local public official to a national level. Though some critics believe that this persona was nothing short of a calculated act, it was effective and the movement gained momentum.
I think Ho Chi Minh's goal determined his behavior. In order to reach the masses, he had to be looking and acting and living like a peasant, to be in communion with the needs of the peasants.
Ho and his followers also promoted the notion that he was a lifelong celibate who didn't have time for romance or a family because he was so devoted to his cause. This was a myth.
It's fairly clear now that he had several relationships. Whether they were formal marriages or not is difficult to substantiate because there are no certificates that we can point to. It's quite well established that he had either a Chinese wife or a Chinese concubine when he was in Hong Kong. No one knows at this point what happened to that woman.
If Ho was married when he returned to Vietnam, it was to his cause. He was much more interested in finding the right people to form the nucleus of his movement. One of Ho's best decisions was to enlist the help of a talented young man named Vo Nguyen Giap. Giap had a brilliant military mind and was a born leader. But when Giap and his men first encountered Ho, they didn't know who he was or why they should follow him. Ho told them that he had been trained in Moscow and that he was going to liberate the country by using the proven methods of his hero, Lenin. Giap and his men, and hundreds of others, soon joined Ho.
I never thought of him as a revolutionary as much as an organization man. What he was a genius at was his ability to organize movements, the front organization particularly.
A popular front is simply a group of groups united in a single purpose. Ho brought many of the other Vietnamese nationalist organizations together under his banner. But in order to do this, he had to focus on the issues that would appeal to the broadest possible group.
One was the issue of national independence, and the other was what might loosely be called social justice, which would mean land reform, better working conditions, democratic rights, and things of that type. You note here not a single word about communism, about collectives, about nationalization of industry, but very simple humanistic ideas that the vast majority of the Vietnamese people could accept.
On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and then launched an all-out attack against the British and Dutch colonies of Southeast Asia. Within weeks, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and Indonesia had all fallen to the Japanese Empire. The Japanese called off their attack on French Indochina when the local pro-Nazi Vichy colonial administration agreed to collaborate with Japan, Germany's Axis partner.
Ho could very well have said, okay, I will side with the Japanese because they're like Asians. But he came to the conclusion, very wisely, the Japanese are no better than the French. They're both aliens. Neither one of them is going to do us any good.
Ho Chi Minh traveled to South China. Since the Chinese were also fighting Japan, he believed that he could get some military aid from the nationalist Chinese. To his surprise, he was arrested by the local authorities because he was a communist. Ho was thrown into prison. He kept a journal, writing mostly in the Chinese of his youth, in hopes of converting his captors to his point of view. In one poem he wrote, "My heart travels 1,000 miles toward my native land. Innocent, I have now endured a whole year in prison. Using my tears for ink, I turn my thoughts into verse." Ho's health deteriorated as the months passed. He had to find a way out of prison, or he would never live long enough to liberate Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh spent 14 months enduring the worst imaginable treatment in prison. As the war worsened for the Chinese, Ho convinced his captors to release him so that he could gather intelligence on the Japanese. He was released in 1943 and walked all the way back to his old base in North Vietnam. His compatriots were stunned. They thought he had died. Once again, he became the leader. He was 53 years old. After the U.S. entered the war against Japan, Ho believed that getting American help was essential to Vietnam's future independence. When an American pilot was shot down in North Vietnam, he was brought all the way back to his base in China by Ho.
And you got to try to imagine this guy. He's wearing sandals and shorts. He's got this wispy beard, and he looks like, you know, he weighs about 85 pounds, and he looks like he'd be blown over with a feather.
Ho offered his services to the commanding officer, General Claire Chennault of the legendary Flying Tigers. Chennault declined the offer, but the Office of Strategic Service, or OSS, America's wartime intelligence service, was interested. They believed that Ho could help them rescue downed pilots, and more important, furnish intelligence information on the Japanese. Ho was accompanied back to his base by an OSS officer, giving credence to his claim that the U.S. was his ally. When the OSS began supplying radios, weapons, and training, it helped establish Ho's Viet Minh as the preeminent Vietnamese nationalist organization. But once again, Ho's life was in jeopardy.
Ho took to his bed and really seemed very sick, so we sent in a paramedic. And indeed, His report, as best I can remember, was saying this cadaverous old bag of bones is why he's living, I don't know. But he opened his kit and fed him every antibiotic he had, and Ho recovered.
Ho greatly appreciated the Americans, and he impressed all of them. He not only spoke and wrote in English, but he seemed to understand their culture too. He had also acquired a very American habit.
He liked to smoke American cigarettes, Philip Morris in particular. But he always carried in his front pocket Vietnamese packets of Vietnamese cigarettes. And then those are the ones that he will offer to the guests.
In August of 1945, 2 atomic bombs brought the war to a rapid conclusion. When Japan surrendered, there was really no one in control of Vietnam. Ho moved quickly into the gap. With General Vo Nguyen Giap leading his guerrilla forces, they took control of the north.
That must have been an electrifying experience for the masses, and they must have felt that this was the moment.
On September 2nd, 1945, nearly 500,000 people attended a huge rally in Hanoi. Ho gave an independence speech that began with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
He quoted directly from Declaration of Independence, and maybe what he was doing was flattering United States so that they could be on his side. He was disarming his opponents by saying that he was not going for Marxist revolution, he was only going for plain, simple independence for his country.
He'd admit to being a communist. He said, you know, my purpose is to free up Indochina. I'm not doing anything different than you did in 1776. You managed to deal with it pretty well, and that's all I'm trying to do now. Do you have any problem with that?
Ho had no illusions about the tenuous nature of Vietnamese independence. In perfect English, he wrote a letter to his OSS contacts stating, "The war is won, but we small and subject countries have no share, or very, very small share, in the victory of freedom and democracy. Probably, if we want to get a sufficient share, we have still to fight." Ho went to Paris in 1946 in hopes of working out a compromise where Vietnam could become autonomous within the French Commonwealth.
I think Ho Chi Minh was trying to postpone the inevitability of armed conflict with France, because I think he was under no illusion that the French would give up without a fight.
Ho's mission to Paris failed. Back in Vietnam, conditions were even worse than they had been before World War II. The French army returned and brutalized the country. As many as 2 million Vietnamese starved to death during a famine, while rice was exported to France. Ho appealed to the U.S. for mediation, but never even received a reply. The emerging Cold War between the Soviet Union and America made France's participation in the defense of Western Europe critical to the U.S. The French agreed to cooperate with the Americans, but the U.S. had to keep out of France's colonial affairs.
Ho Chi Minh was meeting with a rather sympathetic French official. He said to him something that is very, very important, that the French didn't understand at the time, and which also becomes important later for the United States. He says, if we go to war, we're going to lose 10 men for every one that you lose. But in the end, we'll win and you'll lose.
By the end of 1946, Ho, General Giap, and the Viet Minh were back in the jungle fighting a guerrilla war against the French. Initially, it seemed unlikely that the Viet Minh would have any hope in defeating the French. But by 1954, the French were desperate to end the bloody guerrilla war that seemed to have no end in sight. The French decided to spring a trap for the Viet Minh at a place called Dien Bien Phu. They believed that the ensuing battle would end the Indochina War. It did end the war, but in a way they could never have imagined. In March of 1954, the French army believed that they had lured Ho Chi Minh's forces into a trap near a remote outpost called Dien Bien Phu. Unfortunately for the French, they only trapped themselves. The battle cost the French over 15,000 casualties. It also cost them Indochina. The Viet Minh victory over the French marked the first time that a European power had been defeated in battle by its colony since the American Revolution. Ho's leadership and tenacity contributed greatly to the victory, as did the aid of a powerful new ally, the Red Chinese. Ho tried to play down the Chinese Communist support. He feared that this alliance would drag Vietnam into the Cold War.
And this would mean, therefore, that Vietnamese independence would not be a local question between Viet Minh and the French, but would be now an international question between the two superpowers.
Despite the victory at Dien Bien Phu, Vietnam's fate would ultimately be decided at a peace conference in Geneva. Both the Soviet Union and Red China urged Ho to accept the terms of the Geneva Peace Agreement, which divided the country in half at the 17th parallel. It took all of Ho's political skill to get his colleagues to accept the compromise. After 1954, Ho and the Communists concentrated on building a socialist state in the North. They implemented a land reform program modeled after the one created by Mao in China.
And it was a very brutal program. Lots of landowners were executed. It was very corrupt in many cases. The story is that Ho Chi Minh actually realized this thing had gotten out of hand and apologized for it, but of course it was too late. These people had been killed.
The North did not have the only repressive government in Indochina. The U.S. helped install an anti-communist dictator in the South named Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was not popular with his countrymen. In the Geneva Peace Treaty, Ho had been promised an end to foreign intervention and nationwide elections, which he most certainly would have won. Diem and his U.S. backers did not allow the elections to take place. By 1960, an anti-Diem resistance movement engulfed the South in a guerrilla war. The more the North supported the guerrillas, or Viet Cong, the more the U.S. intervened to counter the spread of communism. Just as Ho had feared, Vietnam had become the key battlefield of the Cold War.
We had this idiotic idea that communism was a monolith, that all communists were the same, and Ho was part of that monolith. But there's a lot of evidence that he wasn't. If only we had come to the point where we'd say, okay, he's a communist, but he's our communist, you know?
By 1966, the Vietnam War was in full swing. By now, Ho was 76 years old and probably not involved in the day-to-day conduct of the war. But he was still the prime source of inspiration to the Vietnamese people to fight on, no matter the cost. Ho Chi Minh died on September 2nd, 1969, at the age of 79. Though it would be almost 6 more years before the final Vietnamese victory, most of Ho's countrymen believed that he was the one most responsible for the liberation and unification of Vietnam. Today, Ho Chi Minh's legacy is as controversial and complex as the man himself.
There is On the one hand, the image of Ho Chi Minh as the patriot, the leader of his country's struggle for national liberation, the man of simple tastes, a man who is almost more a Confucian than he is a Marxist or a Leninist. The other image of Ho Chi Minh is as an international communist agent, the head of a repressive regime which carried out policies deeply repugnant to many Vietnamese.
I think you got to deal with the dual character of this man. At the same time that you have this image of the kindly, wispy, emaciated, frail Ho Chi Minh, you got to remember underneath that is a really tough figure, absolutely dedicated, absolutely relentless.
The ends were always more important than the means to Ho Chi Minh. But some critics believe that the communist economic and political system that he left behind was too high a price for independence and unification.
Ho Chi Minh said in 1945, they would like to have Vietnam independence, freedom, and happiness. And from the three slogans, what is left right now? Independence, yes, but what does it mean without having freedom and happiness?
There's no doubt that the communists under Ho often brutally eliminated their political opponents. But Ho's role in this is not clear.
Ho was the leader at the time, and errors did take place, so he should take some of the blame. I think he was a very driven man, a man driven by the cause that he believed in.
As a young man, Ho dreamed of changing the lives of the Vietnamese people, but he probably never dreamed how much he would also change the United States.
Ho Chi Minh hands the United States the first defeat in its history, in the longest war of its history. And in that respect, he should teach us a lesson, which is you don't get involved in wars in these places when you're up against enemies that are intensely, passionately nationalistic and are prepared to make these limitless sacrifices to win.
Recent estimates of Vietnamese casualties since 1946 are placed at over 3,500,000 dead. This staggering number is a reflection of the steely determination of Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese people.
Ho Chi Minh's enduring legacy in terms of his image and the way he is seen around the world, I think probably he's remembered perhaps more than anything else as the leader of probably the most successful movement for national liberation that we've seen in our century.
Ho Chi Minh accomplished an incredible feat in helping to free his country and unite it despite the opposition of France and the United States. This achievement required the efforts of a man who was part Lenin, part Gandhi, part Confucius, and all Vietnamese.